After the break, 13 years ago, I was sued after saying that this woman had chosen to be Aboriginal. I was censored by a judge, I was abused as a Nazi, but now stunning new evidence that makes me feel I was stitched up. Now I've learned something extraordinary. As I say, to me it now seems I've been stitched up. A judge fed a fake story that led him to impose a very damaging censorship. Now, 13 years ago, a socialist activist called Pat Eatock sat in a courtroom and told Justice Morty Bromberg what new evidence tells me was a tall tale, a key part of the evidence that he used to actually ban two of my Herald Sun articles from being republished in a shocking attack on our free speech. Eatock told Bromberg I had intimidated and humiliated and insulted her by writing that she was a white Aborigine who'd chosen to call herself Aboriginal when she plainly had other choices. Now, Eatock's barrister, former Judge Ron Merkel, then read out her statement. This is, according to Eatock, I am an Aboriginal person with Aboriginal ancestry. My grandmother, Lucy Eatock, was born in Carnarvon Gorge in central Queensland in 1874. This is an Aboriginal birthing place. She was of the Kiri people. My grandmother's mother was an Aboriginal woman called Kitty. My grandmother's husband, my grandfather, was an Aboriginal man, Bill Eatock. If only I had known then what I know now about every one of those statements. Having gone through the evidence he himself no doubt believed, this barrister of Pat Eatock, in this case Merkel, smeared me as a Nazi-like person for doubting the genuineness of people like Eatock, who's the lead plaintiff in this action on behalf of 9 fair-skinned Aboriginals that I'd written about. Now, this barrister claimed that my kind of thinking actually led to the Nuremberg race laws, the Nazi ones, and even hinted that I could inspire genocide, adding the Holocaust in the 1940s started with words and finished with violence. It was a disgusting smear, but Eatock won. Justice Bromberg banned my 2 articles, ruling I had racially discriminated against Eatock for saying, among other things, she had had a choice how to identify himself. No, she didn't, he insisted. Nor had the others in the case. They were born Aboriginal. Born Aboriginal. Yet Eatock herself had talked about not identifying as Aboriginal until after her teenage years.
And John Laws was on the radio, and he said something that was really, really racist. And she picked it up and added to it. And I said, hey, you can't say that. I'm Aboriginal, you know. And this was the first time I'd made a statement about, I'm Aboriginal, you know. Mm-hmm. And up until that point in time, it had never, it was a part of me, but it was down. Yeah.
But this judgment against me was momentous, the whole proceedings, because since then very few journalists, almost none at all, seeing what has happened to me, have dared to question the white Aborigines now increasingly found in politics and universities, even ones with not one known Aboriginal ancestor, according to a review of their genealogical records, like Professor Bruce Pascoe, like Professor Kerry Doyle, like South Australian Attorney General Kaya Maher and many others I've since named. And it's no wonder journalists don't dare go where I went, because who wants to risk being damned as a Nazi and a racist? Well, certainly not the barrister hired by my newspaper at the time. I've often blamed myself for not pushing him even harder to challenge Eatock's story, because his cross-examination of her ended where it should have started. Let me read it out to you. My barrister asks Eatock, some of your relatives do not identify themselves as Aboriginal, as you do. Eatock, that's right. My barrister, they've made different decisions about their Aboriginal identity. And Eatock says, that's right. And my barrister then says, nothing further, and sits down. But now I've learned why it's no surprise that most of Eatock's relatives do disagree with her, and did. Last month I did what I didn't realise was possible 13 years ago. You can blame me. I asked professional genealogists of Roger Carr's brilliant darkemuexposed.org website to check Eatock's family tree. The results should embarrass everyone who used the Eatock story to censor the debate on people choosing to identify as Aboriginal. Now, I should first add a disclaimer here. Maybe those genealogists made mistakes. Although I've got to say, Kharja's website has now uncovered many people, including Bruce Pascoe, who wrongly claimed to be Aboriginal, has not been faulted once. And, maybe Eatock herself honestly believed some old family gossip that she perhaps then spun into proof that she was Aboriginal, may have genuinely believed, I don't know. But here is what those genealogists found, which you can now read in massive detail over the next 3 days on the darkemuexposed.org website. Every one of those Eatock claims that I've quoted earlier on are false according to the available records. Now, of course, Eatock is now dead, can't respond, but not one of her ancestors was Aboriginal. Her grandmother Lucy wasn't born in an Aboriginal birthing place in Carnarvon Gorge, but at her parents' home in Springsure, 180 kilometres away, according to her birth certificate. That certificate also shows that Lucy's mother wasn't an Aboriginal woman called Kitty, but a Scottish woman called Jane, who was attended at the birth by a doctor and a midwife. Lucy also didn't look Aboriginal. She looked like a carbon copy of a Scottish mum. Nor are there any records of this Kiri tribe she apparently belonged to. None. Nor any record of an Aboriginal girl called Kitty, who seems to be an invention inspired by a Tongan girl called Lizzie or Takrao, who was taken in by Lucy's parents for a few years after Lucy's birth. Nor was Eatock's grandfather Bill an Aborigine. Eatock made a false conclusion simply from the colour of his skin. In fact, the genealogist found a missing birth certificate showing that Bill's father was Richard Rose, who came from St Vincent and the Grenadines in the West Indies, and had a brief affair here with a married white woman. Now, this Richard Rose turned out to be the son of a British slave owner and an African. He inherited money when his father died and sailed to Australia to become Eatock's Aboriginal ancestor, Pat Eatock's father. When I say Aboriginal, try African American or West Indian American, black. So the conclusion is, Eatock's genealogy shows she should never have been allowed to bring her case against me. If these genealogists are correct, she had no legal standing in the case, since she wasn't Aboriginal. And I was right, more right than I knew then, to say she had just chosen to be Aboriginal. Now, joining me is Roger Kharja, who's head of darkemuexposed.org, whose genealogist helped him to research Pat Eatock's background. Roger Kharja, thank you so much for your time. Are you confident in your findings? What steps did you take?
Well, Andrew, this was she's only got a very short family tree, so it's not that complicated. But the critical thing with this is no one could find a birth certificate for her grandfather, William Eatock. So because there's no birth certificate, all these theories came out that, he was a stolen Aboriginal child, this, that and the other, but no one could prove it. But we've actually found that birth certificate. And no one's ever found the William Eatock birth certificate because there wasn't one under the name of William Eatock. He was born under the name of William Rose. And the moment you have that birth certificate, that suddenly cements a lot of things because he's called William Rose. His mother was called Catherine Davison. His father then becomes Richard Rose because he's on the birth certificate. So then you can follow the Richard Rose line. And so that's why we think we're right. We're the first people in Australia to discover the birth certificate of a man who became William Eatock because he was born William Rose, and no one ever found that before. But it's there in the records, in the Queensland records.
And why does it matter?
Well, it matters because this man, Pat Eatock, says he had a very dark face, right? So she's just assumed that in Australia, if you've got a very dark face, you must be Aboriginal. But she's made a fundamental error. There's lots of dark-faced people in colonial times who were from the West Indies, from UK. They had to come out of Jamaica into the UK, into Australia. And so she's made a fundamental mistake. So because he's called William Rose, he's got a dark face. His father, Richard Rose, if you go and look at his marriage certificate, his later one, it says he's born in the West Indies. So if he's born in the West Indies and he's got a dark face, there's a good chance he's related to, he's become out of a West Indian slave environment. And once you get his name, you know he's in the West Indies from a little island called Bequay in St Vincent's. You go there and you find all the records for Richard Rose, who was the son of William Rose, the planter. Richard Rose in Australia put on his marriage certificate, my father was William Rose, a planter. And if you're a planter in the West Indies, more than likely you're a slave-owning planter. You know, Richard Rose was born, I think, 1831. So that slavery is still going on then. And then he puts his mother name as Harriet Williams. And you look up all the list of slaves on that particular plantation, and there's Harriet, right? He hasn't got a surname, but her first name is there. And so that's how you connect it all. Now, it's not, you know, it's 99.9% accurate. And we don't know, maybe there's Aboriginality in Pat Eatock's family because someone had an affair with an Aboriginal person or there was a child adopted and that was not recorded. But if no one can prove evidence that happened, our evidence is the strongest. And that's why we say she had no Aboriginality through her grandfather, William Eatock, who was born William Rose.
You know, it's funny, this confusion happens more often than people will admit or know. Roberta Sykes, the very famous so-called Aboriginal activist, said to be the first Aboriginal to go to Harvard, was in fact the daughter of an African-American. Same with Madruru Narogan, formerly known as Colin Johnson, the famous author who did a book that's been read by generations of school kids. Again, you know, not Aboriginal at all, African American. How is it then that Pat Eatock could go through life claiming to be Aboriginal, being accepted as Aboriginal, being vindicated in court as Aboriginal, treated by journalists as Aboriginal, yet still not be Aboriginal, gets away with it to the end of her life?
For the same reason that Bruce Pascoe wrote his book and said Aboriginal people were farmers, and hundreds of thousands of people bought the book, only because they wanted Aboriginal people to be farmers. Not that they didn't worry about the evidence, but they wanted that narrative. Same as Pat Eatock. There are so many people in the world, so many supporters who wanted her to be Aboriginal, because then she could go to she was quite eloquent, she could go to the tent embassy, talk to the press, stand for Parliament in, I think, Canberra elections as an Aboriginal, because at that time in the 70s, people wanted Aboriginals to get on in the world. Pat Eatock walks through the door and says, I'm Aboriginal, I'm willing to go into Parliament, I'll help you set up the tent embassy, I'll go at all these conferences as an Aboriginal. She's eloquent, and they say, oh, I'll tick the box. Because this is how it works, the same as Eric Wilmot. Eric Wilmot is there exactly the same time, saying, oh, yeah, I'm Aboriginal, oh, here's a job, mate, you're Aboriginal, and very eloquent people. But at the end of the day, they're not Aboriginal.
Roger Kaj, this case, I think, scared a lot of people out of asking the questions. They saw what happened to me. I thought it was, it was devastating for me personally, but also I thought it was devastating for free speech. I think through your research, I think we've got a firmer case for saying, listen, free speech must be allowed to prevail in this area. So thank you so much indeed for your time and for your efforts.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.